Chapter 1. Because the three Plumbs had agreed on the phone the previous evening that they should not drink in front of their brother Leo, they were all, unbeknownst to one another, sitting in separate bars in and around Grand Central, savoring a furtive cocktail before lunch. It was a strange kind of autumn afternoon. 2 days earlier, a nor'easter had roared up the mid-Atlantic coast, colliding with a cold front pushing east from Ohio and an Arctic mass dipping down from Canada. The resulting storm had dropped a record-breaking amount of snow in some places, blanketing towns from Pennsylvania to Maine with a freakishly early winter. In the small commuter town 30 miles north of Manhattan where Melody Plumb lived, most of the trees were still shouldering their autumn foliage, and many had been destroyed or damaged by the snow and ice. The streets were littered with fallen limbs, power was still out in some towns, the mayor was talking about canceling Halloween. In spite of the lingering cold and spotty power outages, Melody's train ride into Manhattan was uneventful. She was settled in at the lobby bar of the Hyatt Hotel on 42nd Street, where she knew she wouldn't run into her brother or sister. She'd suggested the hotel restaurant for lunch instead of their usual gathering spot, Grand Central's Oyster Bar, and had been mocked by Jack and Beatrice, the Hyatt not landing on their list of venues deemed acceptable by some arcane criteria she had zero interest in decoding. She refused to feel inferior to those two anymore, refused to be diminished because she didn't share their veneration for everything old Manhattan. Sitting at a table near the soaring windows on the upper level of the hotel's massive lobby, which was, she had to admit, completely unwelcoming, too big and gray and modern. Some awful kind of sculpture made of steel tubing lurked overhead. She could hear Jack's and Bee's pointed ridicule in absentia. She was relieved they weren't there. Melody ordered the least expensive glass of white wine, $12, more than she would spend on an entire bottle at home, and hoped the bartender had a generous pour. The weather had remained unseasonably cold since the storm, but the sun was finally breaking through and the temperatures beginning to rise. The piles of snow at every midtown crosswalk were rapidly melting into unnavigable puddles of slush and ice. Melody watched a particularly inelegant woman trying to leap over the standing water and miss by inches, her bright red ballet flat landing squarely in the water, which had to be frigid and filthy. Melody would have loved a delicate pair of shoes like those, and she would have known better than to wear them on a day like today. She felt a twinge of anxiety as she thought of her daughters heading uptown and having to navigate the treacherous street corners. She took a sip of her wine, so-so, removed her phone from her pocket, and opened her favorite app, the one Nora called Stalkerville. She hit the Find button and waited for the map to load and for the dots that represented her 16-year-old twins to materialize on the screen. Melody couldn't believe the miracle of a handheld device that allowed her to track Nora's and Louisa's precise whereabouts as long as they had their phones. And they were teenagers. They always had their phones. As the map started to appear, she felt the familiar panicky palpitations until the tiny blue pulsating circles and the word "found" popped up at the top of the screen, showing the girls exactly where they were supposed to be, at the SAT tutoring center uptown. They'd been taking the weekend classes for over a month, and usually Melody tracked their morning progress from her kitchen table, watching the blue dots slowly glide north from Grand Central according to her meticulous directions. From the train station, they should take the Madison Avenue bus to 59th Street, where they would disembark and walk west to the tutoring center on 63rd, just off Columbus. They were not to walk along the park side, but were supposed to walk on the south side of the street, passing by the parade of uniformed doormen who would hear them scream for help if they were in trouble. They were strictly forbidden from entering Central Park or deviating from their route. Melody put the fear of God into them every week, filling their heads with stories of girls being snatched or lost, forced into prostitution, or murdered and dumped in the river. "The Upper West Side is not exactly Calcutta," her husband Walter would gently argue. But she got scared.